Hey everyone, welcome to episode 4 of Scotch AI. I'm joined this week by 3 legends in the space of answering the question, how do we put a hard dollar value on data? Steve Shipley is a best-selling author, a blogger, and also shares with me an enthusiasm for wine and Scotch. In fact, Steve is the author of a book on wine. Steve, just tell us about that very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's a book I wrote when I tried to retire from corporate life about 6 years ago, basically on how to enjoy and appreciate getting the most out of every glass of wine that you drink. So it talks a lot about how your senses interact with wine. And yeah, it was very good to be able to publish that. And interestingly enough, people think if you write a real book, you're a pretty smart guy, even though that's not true. And but I was just real happy to be able to get that out there.
Wine appreciation, analytics, and AI. What a legend. So Steve lives in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, which is in one of the wine growing regions there, brings him closer to one of his passions. But Steve is also very experienced in managing large and complex organizational change, including corporate mergers and demergers. He's also got significant experience in digital transformation, business governance, IT sourcing strategies. And Steve is a part-time adjunct CIO for IDC Financial Insights, contributing to their core banking, digital transformation, and digital data research areas. Welcome, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, Jar, welcome. Jar is the managing director at Do Data, which is a boutique consultancy specializing in helping Australian businesses from ASX top 10 to small to medium businesses get more value from their data. Jar is actually an ex-colleague of mine from Quantium days and has also worked in leadership roles in McGrath-Nicol, led transformation initiatives for CBA, UBS, Macquarie, Equifax, and others. Jar also is a frequent poster of short, insightful videos here on LinkedIn and on her YouTube channel. So I'll put a connection later on down the bottom to Jar's YouTube channel as well.
Thanks a lot,
And
Mark.
then Damon, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Second time we've graced with Damon's presence. Damon is a data scientist, also founder and CEO of a number of startups in analytics and in AI. He's also been a professional blackjack card counter, sports bettor, and poker player. He then moved into economics and data science, and presently he's running a number of analytics-related initiatives, including Rankster, which we looked at last time, but also, Rankster, which was AI-enabled search engine optimization.
Search engine optimization, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
perfect. And but also he's across chatbots, strategic advisory consulting on AI initiatives, and indeed a machine learning driven methodology for putting a value on data, which is what we'll be talking about today. Just for our audience, you'll see on your left-hand side, which I don't know which direction that is based on what the camera's doing, but you've got the option of throwing some live questions to our audience. And one of the reasons that I run these live is so that we can benefit from that interaction. It's obviously easier to pre-record something, edit it, make it really smooth, and then push it out. But if I do that, nobody gets to ask live questions of our esteemed panel. So put your questions down and we'll seek to answer those through the podcast today. So Jar, let's jump in. I'm thinking back to Quantium days. They certainly found a way to make money from data. Banks, Woolworths was a literal data gold mine and made, some people did very well out of it. What was the secret sauce of turning that oil is the new, or data is the new oil? What was the secret of turning that into monetary return for those guys? And then what have you observed out of that in terms of, monetize, putting an actual dollar value on the data?
Sure, Mark. Thank you for the question. It's a really good one. I'm not sure if I'm the person with the secret sauce, but thinking back to Quantium days, which when we were there, it was 2013, 2014, which is, well, especially in data, quite a long time back now. I think a lot of things went right in terms of the timing. This was obviously pre-GDPR, pre-Cambridge Analytica, a lot of this awareness and legislation about privacy, analytics, data sharing. consent and the issues around that. And they did a lot of things right in that. I think even as a smallish startup, which is when we joined, I think when we joined it was essentially a scale up. I know that when I joined, there was about 100 and something employees versus 600 now. They had some of the most valuable data sets in Australia, and they remain some of the most valuable data sets in Australia. And it did take them, many number of iterations and working with the ultimate clients that purchase that data in order to get the model right. And I think the founders took a lot of risk, made some savvy decisions, learned from mistakes, which really clearly paid off for them.
Yeah, interesting. So that's kind of from the perspective, I guess, of an agency or a consultancy whose entire business is acquiring data, doing stuff with it, developing models, predictive models, propensity models, all the kinds of things that we worked on for Woolies and various others. What have you seen from the inside of an organization, perhaps in your consulting or other areas that you've worked in?
In terms of monetizing data, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think if you were to try to replicate the Quantium model today, I think it's much harder. The regulatory barriers are much, much higher than it was back in 2013 as a first step. And two is that there's so much more competition for third-party data sources. You need a really, really, really good, very broad coverage, lots of data points, a very good data set in order to monetize. But having said that, I've certainly seen large corporates invest in it and do it quite successfully. And I think there's a lot of data sharing coming through. I think that's something we'll see in the next couple of years with consumer data right, and all this legislatory framework that will allow us as individuals or small businesses to pool their data and sell their data as a second sort of de-aggregated third-party data source. But in my work with businesses, I'm of the philosophy that the quickest and fastest way to monetize data is to find insights for your own business. And that works quite well, that it's your own business, it's your own data, and anything that you see in the data that you don't like, you can change immediately. So that's where I see a lot of value come from in terms of driving marketing areas where customers have a demand that's untapped or finding cost efficiencies that were identified previously within the data.
Yeah, sounds good. And I remember seeing one of your recent video blasts on LinkedIn was on that subject as well. You've kind of developed something of a methodology around that. So we'll come back to that. I think that's interesting. I'd like to explore that. Steve, you have provided consulting and advisory into the value of data, sometimes in the context of corporate mergers and demergers, where you really do want to actually be able to put some kind of figure on the value of the data because it's there as part of the negotiations. It's there on the assets and liabilities. So I guess my question is, how have you seen this change in the last 10 years or so? Have you seen improvements in the way we're doing it?
Yeah, I think when I started doing due diligence for transactions, and I've been involved in about a dozen of them over the last 25 years, the first time I was taught to look at the IT systems, basically they had you look at a asset register, they had you look at a contracts database, and they were really looking at the hard assets. For example, and most of what I do is in financial services, where one bank buys another bank or an insurance company buys another insurance company. And they would want to look at, how many ATMs were they buying? How many PCs were they buying? What was the depreciation schedule? Were the things at end of life and that kind of thing? But I quickly realized and started asking the questions of the systems, and were the systems compatible and were the data compatible? And what I've seen in the first few mergers that I did the due diligence on was this, basically a merger is like if one restaurant buys another restaurant, when you start, you've got two restaurants, two kitchens. And while there might be some revenue and increasing opportunities to cross-sell and things like that, most of the benefits associated with, or the value that comes out of doing a merger is synergy opportunities to cut cost. And so what they want to do is be able to serve two restaurants, but only have one kitchen. And what I found out was when you start looking at like an insurance company, its kitchen is really the claims processing department and the claims systems and the policy administration systems. And what I found out was that a lot of times the systems were incompatible and the data was incompatible. And there were conflicts in the way that the two companies looked at policy numbers, customer numbers, et cetera. And that made it very difficult, if not impossible, to actually merge systems and to get to one claim system. And so what I started to do was challenge the value, if you will, or identify, what are the benefits that you're predicting? And if they're going to say that we're going to remove 200 claims managers from the merged organization, or we're going to increase sales by 15%, I would then take a look at each of the benefit areas and then look at if the data was going to make that easy to accomplish or not accomplish. And so it was really by tying the quality of the data to each of the benefit areas that we were able to start to put a value on data, at least for that transaction. And data, we found out, either would be a significant enhancement to the overall value of the transaction, or it would be a diminishing factor. And so we would use that then to negotiate, how much it would cost to actually make the data compatible and be able to achieve the synergy benefits that they have promised their shareholders.
That's interesting, because I've not really thought of it in that way. You think of entity A over here, certain assets, buildings, laptops, like you've said, software licenses, and also data assets. Entity B, similar kind of thing. However, the potential of the value to each other of that data, particularly in the context of a merger, could be zero, because there's no synergy between, the systems are going to be so hard to integrate that you're looking at a $10 million roadmap.
It was negative. I was working for a bank in Venezuela before one of their many crashes, if you will, a long time ago. And they wanted to buy another bank, and the bank that was going to be acquired actually said, "Oh, we've got great IT systems, great core banking system." And that was an attraction for the acquiring bank. But when I looked at it, I said, no, in fact, you're going to be carrying a lot of technical debt with really old infrastructure, big mainframe equipments that are at end of life. This would be a disaster if you actually tried to merge these. I said, it's going to cost you about 45 to 50 million US dollars to be able to really bring these guys onto your platform. And it shocked everyone. But, finally, they did believe me, and we were able to reduce the transaction because of that, and a few other things where they ended up paying about $100 million, or a little bit, about 8% less than what they were originally had offered the other bank.
Wouldn't you like to have a little slice of the value that you provided through that consulting?
Yeah, I find a lot of people don't like to pay a percentage, though, on that type of thing.
Yeah, I'm just interested. We've kind of jumped ahead a little bit from where I was thinking, but thinking of the single entity, of the single organization, that's entity A, if you like, that we were talking about earlier on. The idea of monetizing or not even monetizing, putting a value on the data that you can actually put on the general ledger. I wonder if you've got an example of where that worked really well and how you arrived at that valuation.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of a transaction where one company is buying another company, much like, the value of a brand, it's very, very difficult to evaluate how much to pay for a good brand. And the same thing is true with data. But you can identify goodwill, and you can put that on the balance sheet and depreciate that goodwill over time, or write that goodwill off if it's not realized. So I look at sort of two sides of the ledger associated with that. One is are you picking up data stores that are going to really enhance your business? For example, you might have fraud analytics or credit scoring data that is really, really important. And I think, as Ja had mentioned earlier, a good example would be more and more we're going to see organizations sharing data, and associated with that, they're going to have to figure out the value to each party and the cost to each party associated with that. And I think we've seen a lot of that in the travel industry over the last 2 decades, where ticket revenue sharing systems, swapping airline loyalty points for nights at hotels or car rentals. They've taken a couple of decades, but they've got that figured out. They've developed a market associated with that. But there are opportunities that I have seen where one bank has bought another bank, and they picked up significant credit and payment fraud information and know your customer information that we were willing to pay a good chunk of goodwill to, and we actually did put that on the balance sheet. Now, it doesn't change on a daily basis. Like I think the example you guys were talking about earlier. If you're in the data business, if you're a credit bureau, if you're selling mailing list, that type of thing, you can put that on the general ledger, and you generate revenue associated with data every time you sell a new data score to a new customer, and that type of thing. But mostly what I've seen is, adding a value associated with data at an aggregate level to the balance sheet, and then treating it like a physical asset like property or other computer equipment. But that's again at the aggregate level, buying an entire organization. What I've been more challenged to do is figure out, except for companies that actually deal in data, how to get that down to individual data store or individual transactions that flow through the GL every day.
Yeah, interesting. Damon, thanks for your patience. I'm going to jump to you in just a second, but I've just realized my notes were out of order, and I had a question for Ja that I was going to ask earlier. You've worked with some of the top end of town companies. Have you seen examples of where businesses who should know better in terms of the value of their data have failed to put value on data, and then failed to gain the value from it that they could have done?
Yes, certainly I have. And I think, well, more broadly, just stepping back to give credit where it's due, I think the long-term vision for data for all the big businesses and small businesses I work with have been bang on. They can see the future. They can see 10 years from now, 20 years from now, exactly where they want to be. Where I've seen the biggest mistakes happen is investment that doesn't align with what they can do with the data at a point in time. So it's very easy to get excited, and corporations tend to overinvest in infrastructure and overinvest in teams of expensive data analysts and data scientists to pull insights that the organization is just not ready to use, whether or not it's not ready to change, they're not ready to change based on data insights, or the insights is just too granular for the business to actually use, because they need automation or some sort of major process change in order to keep up with that.
Interesting. Yeah. So there's a synergy that needs to be in place then, obviously, between the data and the ability of bringing insights out of that data, and then the ability of the organization to adapt or to respond or to embrace, a certain level of organizational maturity, where it's what we call the data-driven organization, right? Can they actually handle the truth?
Yeah, exactly. Or what are they going to do with the truth if they can handle it? If it's like, well, it costs us way too much to do anything with this, because we need to change all these manual processes, invest millions of dollars in training for less millions of dollars of benefit, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, and I think as well is that something people forget is that everything changes so fast in data, especially the infrastructure and technology, the things that people tend to invest a lot in. And what I do see is that people pay for something that they need, say, 5 years from the time they paid it. But by the time that 5 years comes through, they can get the same thing for a fraction of the cost as a cloud provider or an automated solution. So they lose a lot of value that way.
Yeah, interesting. And actually, that whole question about the maturity of an organization being willing to handle the truth, Damon, reminds me of a mutual friend of ours, Eugene Dubasarski. Dr. Eugene Dubasarski is one of his frequent talking points is around the capacity, particularly at the C level, to take gut instinct and ego and evaluate that against what the data is saying and actually handle that cognitive dissonance in a mature way to say, actually, maybe I'm wrong, maybe my gut instinct is wrong, maybe my 30 years of experience is telling me something that is contrary to what the data is actually saying. I'm just interested, Damon, of examples maybe where you've worked, where you've been able to bring a valuation of data to a client, and then was the response to those insights or to that advice conducive? Did they embrace change, or have you found significant resistance, or was it the end of your engagement and what they did with the data and the insights was up to them, and you had to walk away as a consultant?
Great question. So we see the problem that it's being so big that we created a whole product around this called Aurum Data. And Aurum Data, the first part of it is we use a machine learning algorithm to value data. So getting back to Steve's point about putting a value to line items of data and then aggregating it up to a total value, we've got our own proprietary methodology to do that. And then off the back of that comes commercialization opportunities. Once we fully understand a data set, that's when we can start to suggest commercialization opportunities. And one of the biggest problems that we've found so far when we've worked with businesses is they often don't even understand what data they have. So part of the initial scope is identifying where all the data sources are and whether they talk to one another, as Steve mentioned as well, especially when you get into large institutions that have a number of different systems that they've bolted on as they've made acquisitions over the years. Well, often these data sets just don't talk to one another. So at Aurum Data, we identify the data sets, we use our own proprietary technique to value them, and then that leads on to commercialization discussions. And often, I'll take Gia's point, that often commercialization begins with bringing extra value to your own business. And the low-hanging fruit that we've found is in customer data. Businesses that have lots of customer data don't fully understand the magnitude of what they've got and the opportunities that exist. And it could be as simple as improving retention. And we've worked with a couple of insurance companies around modeling, doing propensity modeling around churn rates and trying to reduce churn rates and having proactive campaigns where if someone's at risk of dropping, say, an insurance policy, that they could go out with some proactive messaging to try to retain it, or at least be alert to the fact about who the most likely customers are to drop off. So that's like customer data is the low-hanging fruit when it comes to getting value from data, as far as we've seen. There's also another form.
Just before you move on, can you give us a real story of where that's worked and kind of a before and after view, and what was the delta in terms of value?
Yeah, I can't mention the company for commercial reasons,
No,
but they
fine,
this is quite a large insurer, and they were looking to get some modeling, some data science in for the first time around churn rates. So they had incredible time series over 20 years, and they really did a good job of capturing the data, but they hadn't applied any thought to how this data could be used to model churn rates. So we put together a propensity model, and we could rank each of their customers and their probability of cancelling a policy, and it's based on things like age, demographics, the price that they were paying, stage of life, all of that sort of stuff. And it would come up with a metric, and then they use that list and created outbound campaigns to try to message these customers in order to reduce their lapse rates. And well, it's a pilot program, but like early stages, it's looking promising, and they're looking to invest a lot more into this area.
Yeah, sounds good. So you've
one
got
other
this.
thing. I was just going to say
ahead.
one other thing, Mark. There's also a whole area of data sets that often aren't thought about, and that's publicly available data sets and drawing information
Right.
from them. And I'm on the board of Opal, which is a publicly listed company in Australia, and we've just spent a year and a half examining clinical trial data. And there's a massive problem here that clinical trials that pharmaceutical companies run aren't structured correctly. And we've been able to use publicly available data sets, interrogate them, and come up with better structures when pharmaceutical companies are setting up these trials to increase the probability of a trial succeeding. Now, think about this in the context of COVID-19. Some of the trials out there, we're grading at about a 5 or a 10% chance of succeeding. If some data science was applied to this and the trials were structured optimally, it could increase the chance for each trial by about 5 to 10%. And think there's 475 trials going on at the moment. So, using big data that's publicly available, the outcome could have been much better. But it's amazing that such a large industry like the pharmaceutical industry hasn't embraced this type of technology yet, given the massive dollars at stake. So that's a good example of using publicly available data to draw out value as well.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because I've been in this space for 20-something years, and I tend to think of most organizations as being fairly mature and fairly embracing of analytics, and yet you've called out a couple of verticals where we still seem to be just a couple of years out of kindergarten almost.
We find the opposite. Sometimes it's the smaller, nimbler companies that have embraced data science. The larger the organization, often, the more bureaucracy and the harder it is to get things over the line. When you get multiple layers of management, and don't get our mutual friend Eugene started on this, trying to get data science into businesses when there's multiple levels of management, it's sometimes very challenging.
I can imagine. And you mentioned earlier a methodology that you have, which is machine learning driven. I want to come back and unpack that a little bit. But just before we do, Steve, you must have some kind of framework or methodology that you've used in terms of data valuation in a lot of the work that you've done. Yeah, can you sort of unpack that a little bit for us? Maybe share a little bit of the secret sauce, if there is any.
Sure. By the way, I'm not a data scientist, or I've never really worked with data analytics and the way that Zhao and Damon have. I work with data at the operational level, and I see where very poor quality data hinders being able to achieve, the value that organizations claim that they're going to achieve. And I think one of the key things is, aside from the technology, a lot of what I do is just try to help the communication and get the right people in an organization talking to one another to agree on what the value is associated with data, at least qualitatively, if not quantifiably. But what I found, I was working with a bank in the US about 25 years ago, and there was a big marketing. They would actually take their data every week. They would export it to a marketing firm called Hart Hank, I think the name was, and they would do all the stuff that Damon was talking about, going against a demographic database, census databases, purchasing databases, and they would then use that to put together marketing initiatives and business development initiatives for this bank. And the bank, at that point, this is when customer relationship management systems were starting to be available, but the bank, had very strict investment criteria around IT projects, and they needed a payback within 18 months. They needed to see a return on investment of over 300%, but they didn't have a clue. They knew they wanted to have a CRM system and they wanted to invest in that, but they didn't have a way to really be able to understand how to do that. Much like digital transformation today, a lot of companies feel they have to do it. They know they have to do it even to survive because their competitors are doing it, but they actually don't know how to put a value on, how to actually define benefits which are new. So one of the things I did for this bank 25 years ago, and I've been using it since, is take a qualitative approach. So when I look at a benefit area, if you can find a quantitative financial measure that is the benefit area is known. Everyone agrees on the size of the benefit. Everyone agrees on how to value it. And when I'm talking about that, it's not just the IT department, but the business lead in the business area and the CFO and the CRO. Then you can usually get some pretty good agreement around being able to quantify a benefit area. But if you don't have that and you're looking at things, for example, what Zhao had mentioned, when people start sharing data, we know that selling insights, selling data platforms to other parties is a big, big opportunity. And IDC talks about data monetization for banks in 7 different ways. 2 of them are improving your performance internally by, being able to create and populate more digital twins, automation of decision making on credit, approving payments, that type of thing. But the real big opportunity in the 5 different areas that we see is actually externally monetizing, the massive amounts of historical data and the data that's collected on a daily basis in, the really large banks and insurance companies. By selling that and partnering with fintechs and neobanks and challenger banks. And in that, when you look at that, you really have to look at that qualitatively or strategically. So I basically just, I use a simple Kepner-Trago method to go, looking at that. And while this isn't a data value example, I used to build capacity planning models, and I was doing some work for Singapore Airlines about 20 years ago. And the IT department was screaming they need to make more and more of an investment, but the business people didn't really trust the IT people. And so what the business people said was, look, if you can prove to me that I need more computers because the number of flights I have has gone up, the number of passenger miles has gone up, my revenues have gone up, I've added more locations I'm flying to, then I will let IT spend more on technology to support that. But don't tell me, don't throw IT lingo at me and expect me to give you money to invest further. So I said, okay, well, I think we can probably build a business capacity planning model that translates into how many computers and that you have to build. So I sat down with the head of marketing and I said, what do you think your growth is going to be over the next 5 years? And he goes, oh, it's impossible, absolutely impossible to be able to answer that. There are just so many factors that we don't understand. I said, okay, well, I'll build a model and I'll assume that the number of passenger miles will increase 10% every year for 5 years. And he goes, oh, no. I said, we've got some really nifty marketing programs we're putting in place and loyalty programs. It's going to be higher than that. I said, okay, I'll make it 15% a year for 5 years. And he goes, no. I said, that wouldn't be sustainable. Our marketing budget would be too big. He said, it'll be higher in the first years, but not as high in the second. And so, we're 3 minutes into the conversation and I said, okay, I'll make it 15% a year for 3 years and 10% a year after that. And he goes, yeah, that sounds about right. And so, this was a conversation where by asking the right questions, I was able to tease out numbers that he thought were impossible to, put together. And a lot of that has to do with when you look at benefit areas and the dependency upon data quality, data governance, the investment in data scientists and that to be able to achieve those benefits. I like to define a credit, if you will, a benefit credit that I assign to data to be able to achieve that. And, usually by doing that, the CFO, the chief risk officer, again, if it's a big thing like monetizing data externally, there's a risk factor that you'll ever be able to accomplish that. You'll ever be able to sell your data to, hundreds of other fintechs and that. So then we discount that or put a risk factor against that. But when you look at things quantifiably, you can usually get the CFO and the CRO and the business executive leads to all buy into that as long as they've been involved in that process along the way. So if they agree on the benefit areas initially, if they agree on the cost, if they agree on the metrics you're using to allocate that benefit credit to data stores, they can't disagree with the results, if you will, at the end. So a lot of it is making sure the right people are involved in being able to make that agreement along the way.
Fascinating. That reminds me of some work I did. This is probably my first consulting gig. It may have been with Telstra many years ago, and a gentleman called Wayne Anderson, who had developed a model for revenue projection over the coming 5 years. And they'd gone into Bureau of Statistics projections on population, and then how many would live in cities, and they had it worked out by postcode. Then how many people live in caravans, how many people living in caravans are going to have a phone, what the take-up rate's going to be, the construction of new dwellings, small businesses moving into, bringing in a second phone line, and all of the, the assumptions were all kind of documented, because it was all, 15% here, 10% there, just like you've said. But they had all this other kind of, and it was publicly available data from the ABS to model this out over 5 years. And then they had the pricing as well. It's what, $30 a month for a fixed line telephone connection back then as it was, but that's going to go down to $29 a month in 3 years because of, factor X or whatever. And a very accurate model. And 1 year, he actually predicted Telstra's revenue in the consumer market within 1%, which was a phenomenal achievement. It was like incredible.
Right.
Wayne, if you're out there, you still got my admiration. But you mentioned data quality and data governance. Maybe, Jar, I could pick up on your experiences where companies have, got data that could be incredibly valuable from an analytics perspective, from a predictive model perspective, predicting churn, predicting some of the things that we've talked about. But either because of poor quality or poor governance, they've just not been able to materialize that benefit. I wonder if you have an example for us. A story. I love stories. Tell us a story.
A story. Well, look, I think to Damon's point, a lot of businesses just don't know what data they have, and it's all over the place, or it's not being retained in the proper way. It's not catalogued in the proper way, and all that. And I'm certainly seeing a lot of large businesses embarking on that course of work to improve their data governance and quality. But I think ultimately it's easy in principle, but quite difficult to implement because a lot of the times it means that once you have your entire IT system and infrastructure overhauled, for example, in a cloud-based system where all the backups and all the streaming's automated, you have perfect governance, but that is a very, very expensive and a multi-year journey.
Yeah, interesting. And there must be a point probably where you'd hit diminishing marginal returns on trying to improve quality, governance, and all of those things, right? It's almost like maybe the 80-20 rule. We can get 80% of the value out of our data in the first 20% of the data quality uplift project. And at that point, we think that's probably enough. Steve, you're thinking of something right there.
I think it's actually applying 80-20 to 80-20 and coming up with 96-4, if you will. I mean, some of the big banks, big global banks I've worked with, they have a couple 100,000 different data elements across different data lakes, databases, and that. And what I found out, and the reason I'm able to do the IT due diligence quite quickly, is for a bank or an insurance company, you really only have to focus on 4 or 5 data elements that are going to be problematic or not. A lot of the other data easily is compatible in that. And of course, you might have errors in the data, and you want to be able to use more and more, I think, artificial intelligence and machine learning is really, if you provide the right templates or the right models, you can pick a lot of those problems up right away. But when I look at a bank or an insurance company, I look at a customer number, the way they define account numbers is a branch and customer number put together, to provide a unique ID. That used to work 40 years ago, but then if you wanted a second savings account, you had to sequentially number it 1 and 2. Those are the problem areas, and there's really only 4 or 5 data elements that you need to really chase down the data lineage with the upstream and the downstream systems to see if you're going to have a problem or not. So getting that scoped right is really, really important, because you just can't look at a couple 100,000 data elements and pour through all of that information. The diminishing returns start very, very quickly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've always thought of the data governance approach in that sense. Start with something that's small, manageable, and has a high value or high return, and maybe it is single view of customer or some element like that. And get your lineage right, get your governance right, get your data dictionaries right, get your agreed definitions right. And from that point, you can then begin to massively uplift the value that you can get from a fairly pristine kind of data set. Steve, you mentioned the whole area of AI in that context, and so I want to flip back to Damon. What can you tell us about how you use machine learning to put a valuation on data?
Yeah, so this is a 2-year journey, and we've got to the stage now where we're taking customers on. So when we look at a data set, we record about 100 things around that data set. Now, I won't give away all 100, but a couple of them are fairly obvious, like the size of the data set would be one. But a very critical one is how unique that data set is as well. Do other companies have that data set? How often is it refreshed? How complete is it? So we record it's actually over 100 things about a data set, and we've done that for several hundred data sets. So that, if you like, when you think about machine learning, that data that we've collected, it forms your X variables. And on the Y side, we've got a proxy for the value of that data by talking to the management, etc., drawing out a value. And then we use machine learning to work out what impact are those X variables having on the value of that data. And in fact, we use explainable AI so that we can say, okay, data uniqueness might be the most important factor, and this data set that we're valuing that the model hasn't seen isn't very unique, so it's going to score low for that factor, but it might have a number, like a high number of records, so that might be helping it. So we break a data set down into its constituents, very granular, with these 100 features that we record, and then we can use that to value a data set that the model hasn't seen, doing an out of sample prediction. And just predicting the value is of some use. Of course, the holy grail here is to get this information onto the balance sheet, and there's a lot of hurdles. Accounting regulations being the number one hurdle. They're not keeping up with how the value of data has changed with the internet and big data and customer data becoming so widespread. The accounting standards haven't changed, so it's still a bit of a battle to get the value of this data onto the balance sheet. So that's the first thing that we do, is forecast the value of the data. But more importantly, we look at the X variables. And using explainable AI, we come up with ways where you can enhance your data set, and it might be by collecting extra information, or by better curating an additional data set by drawing in other third-party data sets, or in fact having partnerships with private companies that might have the missing link when it comes to data sets. A good example of this is we work in the transport sector. So we work with the TAC down here in Victoria, who are the road authority, and they've got incredible crash statistics by GPS location going back a number of years. And there's another company called IRAP who have all the road characteristics for those crash statistics. So for every 100 meters of road, they record 70 things about that bit of road, like the speed limit, the quality of the road, how many lanes, the curvature, etc. So by combining those two data sets, you now have the most unique data set in the world for analyzing crash information and trying to optimize countermeasures to reduce fatalities and major injuries, trying to optimize expenditure on how to fix roads to save lives. So that's an excellent example of drawing into data sets to form where there's obvious synergies.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I'm hearing some themes come out here. Themes being that concept of open source data or openly available data sets. And actually, we've seen quite a lot of that around, even in the government space, right? So data.gov, data.gov.au. The one that was my favorite was the city of Seattle has a website that was like, I think it was data.seattle.gov or something like that. And it's got real-time feeds of 911 calls. So somebody makes an emergency call and it pops up as a, and you can make an API call into that and find out, where the emergency was and what type of emergency it was, and all kinds of interesting kind of things that you can do. But Damon, you've hit on an even better example, which was, open source data over here about what the roads look like and data over here about what the crashes were. And I think in every industry, you've got the potential for that. And I'm thinking of Data Republic as well, who kind of set up a kind of a hub where companies could share and potentially monetize their data assets, either partly anonymized or, ways of creating a data exchange, in fact.
Yeah, well, the
so
most obvious data source that we've used is census data. So one of the models we built was a propensity model for default risks on loans. So we had all this customer data, but by just ingesting census data around a postcode that someone lived, it was able to increase the accuracy of that model by about 5 to 10%. So that's an example of a very simply accessible public data source that you can ingest to enrich an existing private set. And often it's not thought about, like companies don't think about ingesting public data, and there's massive benefits to doing it.
Yeah, actually, and here's one. So a friend of mine worked on this project for a bank in the Middle East, which was around the risk involved in financing a small business. And the input data they used was all around social listening. What are people saying about this business on Facebook and on various other social media? Because that was a more reliable indicator of whether the business was going to survive or not, and therefore as to what kind of a risk it was to go and finance that business. Fascinating
Great
model.
example. Yeah. Perfect example.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to have to wrap up. I might just throw out for final comments from each of you. Steve, you look like you were going to go first.
No, I was just going to say also the World Bank, IMF, and that provide a number of data sets that you can tap into that just have invaluable information about, making investments in different countries and the concentration of wealth and that type of thing.
Interesting. Yeah. Ja, any final thoughts?
Oh, I think, yeah, look, it looks like, obviously when we're in the industry, it sounds like a very slow upwards journey, but it's progressed a lot. Like I think back to our Quantium days, and I look forward to seeing data sharing, data monetization progress even more.
Yeah, definitely. And then the other theme that I was hearing was around, actually I've forgotten what I was going to say. I'll throw it back out. Damon, final thoughts before we talk about our Scotch and then we wrap up.
Yeah, I think data valuation is in its infancy. The big four consulting companies have not looked at this in any detail. They're only starting to now, and it's surprising to me that it hasn't been at front of mind. I think it's a very difficult problem to solve, and there's massive valuations for companies like Amazon, Facebook, who have never actually really turned a profit until recent years, but their market cap is so big, and it's all around data valuation. But yet there's no established method to value data, and that's what we've tried to do at Aurum. And I think this industry that part is in its infancy, and over the next few years there'll be a lot of attention in data valuation.
Yeah, fantastic. So for each of Ja, Damon, and Steve, for anybody who wants to follow up and have a conversation with them around data in general, or specifically for services that they might be able to provide, I'll make sure that those links are down in the bottom of our YouTube comments. Now, we call ourselves Scotch AI because every episode we review a Scotch. And so I grabbed one that a friend of mine gave me for my birthday back in January this year. So this is an Ardbeg. Now, this is a single malt from the Islay region, and there's the distillery right there on the coast. So it's right on the water, and you can actually taste the saltiness, or in fact, more of an iodine kind of flavor. I mean, it's quite peaty. You definitely get the peatiness of the typical Islay Scotch. Quite strong on the spirit, but also this you can taste the ocean breeze wafting over the malt before they bring it into the stills and so on. So it's a lovely drop probably not one that you would begin the evening with. You'd start with something a little bit softer, like a Glenfiddich or something. But then you'd move on to the Ardbeg, and as I say, you always finish with a Lafroig. One of these days, I'll bring a Lafroig in. So on that note, guys, thank you so much. I've really appreciated your insights, your conversation. I think it's been fascinating. There's so much. We could go off in so many different directions from this conversation right here around the data valuation side, the data governance side, the quality, the uplift, the whole 80-20 or 96-4 rule, Steve. So maybe we'll just have to deep dive on one of those themes in a few weeks' time and come back again. So
sure. I mean,
thanks everyone so much.
Good problem to solve is I watched a documentary last night on American bourbon, and he was trying to figure out how many barrels to set down so he'd have enough 18-year-olds to sell in 2038. Now that's a data challenge we should get focused on.
Hopefully X equals Y minus the stuff that we tasted along the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Jav, Damon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Really appreciate it. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks' time, we'll be talking about the future of cybersecurity. So we kind of take a pivot on our topic, but it's going to be a fascinating one. And I'll have a couple of experts from other parts of the planet. We're going global. And we'll be talking about the future of cybersecurity in 2 weeks' time. Hope to see you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mark.
Mark.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.